From the Trinity River Authority to Southland Corporation to Las Colinas Incorporated, David Brune has been associated with some of the most significant institutions in this community. We learn more about this visionary businessman in this edition of Profiles. Mr. Brune, as you take a broad look at your career, there's one thing that's sort of elemental to your career, and that's very elemental. It's the element of water. You've been involved for many years with helping to lay the groundwork for conserving and developing plans to help us have long-term implementation of that very vital resource. And I know it's not something that people necessarily think about. They know it's a vital resource, but it's not something that impacts their lives until they think, oh no, I'm not going to have any. Could you talk a little bit about the period of time that Texas was actually facing a very severe drought and the effects that it had?
Well, first you have to go back and look at the overall history of Texas since the mid-1840s. And the history of Texas from then to today has been a series of recurring droughts and recurring floods. So people involved in Texas have had to be interested in long-range water supply to be able to get through the next drought, and to be interested in flood control so that the floods that we do have don't devastate our land and our property and our buildings. And so I started out in 1959 as an attorney for the San Antonio River Authority, and that led me into a career directly involved in water resource development off and on since then to today.
Water resource development is the kind of phrase that is very, very descriptive, but unless you talk about it in the terms that you just have, in terms of the feast and then famine of having water around, you don't necessarily think about it. Your first experience, you mentioned, was with the San Antonio River Authority.
That is correct.
What kinds of programs did you put into place with that organization, and how did you come to be associated with them?
Well, I started out as an outside lawyer, and I wound up being the general counsel and then the general manager. But the San Antonio River Authority's fundamental job was flood control for the heart of the city of San Antonio. And I was deeply involved in that from 1959 to 1968. In 1961, the Texas legislature reorganized the San Antonio River Authority and put it into the long-range pollution control and water supply business. And the San Antonio River Authority completed the first basin-wide pollution control survey in Texas, and then started to develop a long-range water supply program, which unfortunately was never implemented, and San Antonio remains today the only major city in the United States without a long-range surface water supply.
That certainly indicates how important it is to do that kind of long-range planning.
Right.
When you think of San Antonio and you think of river, you automatically associate it with that beautiful area that they've developed for the city. So obviously water is an economic resource as well.
That's right. The San Antonio River Walk is the prime tourist attraction in San Antonio. And the San Antonio River Authority played an important role in certain parts of that Riverwalk project.
So during your period of time with the San Antonio River Authority, which I think lasted till about 1968, you met a someone who had a huge impact on your life.
And that was Ben Carpenter. I met him in the mid-1960s as a result of my involvement in statewide water activities.
When you say statewide water activities, are you referring specifically, to your time working with the legislature to pass these various laws?
Well, yes, and the Ben Carpenter was the person responsible primarily for the creation of the Trinity River Authority by the legislature in 1955. And the various river authority groups had quarterly meetings and were very much in contact with each other to sort of have a common front as to statewide water policy. And I met Mr. Carpenter through those quarterly meetings.
What kinds of things at that point in time, because you shared with me that you admired the way Mr. Carpenter was handling the business, what kinds of things were going on at that point in time?
Well, Texas was really getting into its first serious statewide water planning effort, and also an effort to use state funds for long-range water resource development. And the city of Irving was one of the early beneficiaries of that program by purchasing the water rights in Cooper Reservoir in East Texas. That, for the city of Irving, was a very bold stroke. And so it was those were the kind of things that were going on in the late 50s, the early 60s, that were very dynamic for this state. And so the people who were involved in the leadership in their various river basins were very much in contact with each other and working towards a common cause.
Can you describe what that early work has led to in terms of what we're experiencing right now in terms of the availability of water as a resource?
Well, during the late, well, actually, in terms of the Trinity area, you have to go back to the work that the Carpenter family and the Amon Carter family did starting in 1928 that led to the master plan for the entire development of the Trinity River Basin, which is an area of 17,000 square miles. And it is a result of that that today we have in place the major reservoirs that provide both flood control and water supply for the upper Trinity Basin.
And would those be the various area lakes?
Well, that would be primarily Louisville Lake and Grapevine Lake and Lavon Lake. They were all built in the early 60s, and actually they were started in the early 50s. And then the second wave of reservoirs were Joe Poole and Ray Roberts. And then the city of Dallas, as part of the Trinity Master Plan, built Lake Ray Hubbard, and then went on to the east to the Sabine River Basin and the Natchez River Basin for additional Dallas water supplies.
Can you describe a scenario that might be in effect right now as we are facing a drought? I don't know if people think of it in terms of a drought, but in fact that's where we are. What would be a scenario right now had that kind of planning not taken place at that point in time?
Well, you would have severe water rationing. And in fact, when we had the last major drought, which started in the summer of 1949 and lasted till April of 57, the Dallas area, and I'm talking about Dallas County, was ill prepared. And there was severe water rationing, and there were 3 steps taken to try to provide water, really only one of which was partially successful, and that was importing Red River water down into the Elm Fork of the Trinity River. But that water was very salty and had did a lot of damage to water pipes and hot water heaters and shrubs throughout the Metroplex. On the other hand, the city of Fort Worth, starting in the 1920s, had created the Tarrant County Water District and had tremendous water supplies to go through that drought that never had any problem whatsoever. And it put Dallas sort of under a microscope. But fortunately, because of the plans that Mr. Carpenter and his father had done, these first wave of reservoirs were under construction and came online right at the end of the drought. But you would have severe water rationing.
And
you wouldn't be able to water your shrubs.
You wouldn't be able to water your shrubs. There would be water for food, yes, possibly water for bathing. Yeah. And then the subsequent problems, I guess, for farmers and such would be a huge raise in prices.
Well, I think the thing that would happen to the agriculture economy is that a lot of farmers would go bankrupt. You just have a complete turnover and a virtual shutdown in production of farm products in the drought area, which you did in the previous drought.
While I don't want to paint a doomsday scenario, especially with the significant holiday that we have coming up, I did want to show how severe a problem it would be had the planning not taken place. Now, to go back to the period of time where you were becoming a business acquaintance of Mr. Carpenter's, he did in fact ask you to come to this part of the world for another river authority.
That's right. I was asked to come to the Trinity River Authority to become its first general manager, and arrived on the scene on May 1st of 1968 and have lived in the Metroplex ever since, although I did finish high school in Dallas, graduating in 1948 from Jesuit High School. But and my mother's family were pioneers in northern Collin County. But I grew up in the Navy until my father retired in 1946. So basically, I've always called this part of Texas my home.
And so it was important, I'm sure, that once you were back in this part of your home to really lay the groundwork for some things that would keep it progressing toward the future.
Well, the Trinity River Authority played a very dramatic role in cleaning up the Trinity River through its sewage treatment plants and through its basin-wide water quality studies, and getting other entities to be more serious about pollution control. And then the Trinity River Authority has also been involved in water supply and has worked closely with all the other entities in this area. So, now the City of Dallas is going forward with the Dallas Floodway Extension, which was an early project of the Trinity River Authority. So the Trinity River Authority has done a lot for water resource development in this area. It is the largest operator of sewage treatment facilities in the state of Texas.
That's pretty extraordinary. And when you think in terms of, had that not been in place, the conditions that we might be living with now would be a completely different landscape for this part of the state.
Yes, it would be, and I think people don't appreciate how clean the Trinity River is today compared to what it was in the late 40s.
Can you describe what it was like?
Well, it was just a black ditch.
That's not very attractive
And
sounding.
the water was very, very foul.
There were periods of time, and I haven't experienced them since I've been in Dallas, but I can remember that older people would tell me all the time, oh, that Trinity, it smells bad.
Oh, it did.
That's incredible.
It did, all the way down.
Oh, my goodness, from the top to the bottom.
Right.
That is incredible. During your period of time with the Trinity River Authority, these various things that you've been describing were put into place, and some things finalized, the various lakes you've described and plans for additional things. And your association with Mr. Carpenter continued.
Yes. In 1978, Mr. Carpenter asked me to come to work at Southland Financial Corporation, and I was not able to make that move, but I did the year later in 1979 and began working in Irving, and have worked here continuously since then and been very involved in Las Colinas.
That was a move for you from things that you'd been doing for a significant portion of your career. But Mr. Carpenter had some plans and thought that you would be an excellent person to help him implement them. You mentioned that you spent a day with him out here in
October of 1978, I spent a day with Mr. Carpenter and just learning about Las Colinas, and I was just overwhelmed by the attention to detail in the planning of Las Colinas and in the execution of those plans. And I really did want to come to work for Mr. Carpenter, but I couldn't make the move then because I had made a commitment to the Trinity River Authority Board on some legislative items in early '79, and when that was over with, then I was anxious to come to work in Las Colinas and to be a part of the Southland Financial team.
You mentioned when we talked before that one of the things that's sort of been a guiding principle in your life has been discovering a good and worthy cause and then devoting your time and attention to it. What made Las Colinas appeal to you?
Well, there were several aspects. One was I had worked with Mr. Carpenter on the Trinity River program from 1968 until 1973 when he went off of the Trinity River Authority Board. And I had an enormous admiration for his judgment, his ethics, his attention to detail, his fair treatment of people. And so I was very anxious to come to work for him because I admire Mr. Carpenter greatly. And so I was very anxious to make the move, and I worked directly for Mr. Carpenter from May 1st of 1968 until I worked at Southland Financial from September of '79 until December of '86, when he stepped down as chief executive officer. And during that period, there was never a day in which I wasn't thrilled to get to work.
That is quite a statement to be able to say. Absolutely. Now, during
and there were some difficult times in that, but I had such a great admiration for Mr. Carpenter and for the manner in which he did business. He was so very fair and really worked hard at being fair with people. He was a tough negotiator, but he was always fair, and he had a very high standard of ethics, and that really was something I enjoyed.
You mentioned to me, and this is a delightful and very illustrative story, I think, that Mr. Carpenter was a difficult taskmaster, but that he himself was always ready to do whatever it took.
Mr. Carpenter was the epitome of a leader. He never asked anyone to do anything that he himself wouldn't personally do. And I can remember a very interesting story. He was very interested in tree preservation, and we were planning a specific area of Las Colinas, and he was very interested in saving the trees in that area. And it so happened we were having a flood, but three of us got on horseback, including Mr. Carpenter, and got out in the flood and staked out put some heavy posts in that staked out the area that was to be tree preserved, and I thought that was very interesting. But he didn't ask somebody else to go out there and get on a horse and ride through the floodwaters. He led the charge himself, and Stan Lynch and I were on a horse with him, or horses with him.
That is the epitome of a leader.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, there was another...
and he worked unbelievable hours, too. He didn't ask somebody else to be down there on Saturday unless he was down there on Saturday.
That's telling, absolutely. Yeah. The Carpenters owned the land that would ultimately become Las Colinas for a long period of time prior to developing. What was the decision made, or I should ask, when was the decision made to keep that land rather than sell it?
Well, the Carpenters started acquiring that land in the mid-20s, and it was a working livestock ranch. It was not all cattle. Mr. Carpenter's father was a large marketer of mules and donkeys, and so they had a variety of livestock. Mr. Carpenter, Ben Carpenter himself, wrote a definitive book on donkeys, but in any event, it was a working livestock ranch, and the Carpenters in the I'd say around 1963, were entertaining the possibility of selling the land, the whole ranch, and when the decision was made by the FAA, and it was quite a decision right out of the blue, that there would be an international airport, and that Love Field and Amon Carter Field would be de-emphasized, and Amon Carter Field shut down. The Carpenters then made a family decision that they would hold on to the ranch and develop it basically as a project of starting out as Southland Life Insurance Company. And that was then when they started working on the plans, but the real planning of Las Colinas did not start till 1968.
When Mr. Carpenter invited you out to the ranch during the I think it was 78.
That's 78.
What kinds of ideas and plans did he share with you that he wanted to bring you on board to implement?
Well, he really just gave me a total education on Las Colinas, and but was not very specific about what role I would play. That came into being later, and really I was brought to Southland Financial Corporation to be an administrator, and I was the chief administrative officer of Southland Financial Corporation, and he wanted to bring the administrative elements of the subsidiary companies like Southland Life and Las Colinas Corporation, Southland Trust, Southland Land and Cattle Company, and so on, into a central administrative area, and then have the employees in those various companies be basically line operating employees. And so that was the trust that was given to me, and it was a very great trust, and I enjoyed those years. But in 1980, when we had this terrible hot weather spell that lasted 30 days, our lakes began evaporating. There are 57 lakes in Las Colinas. I don't know whether people realize that or not, but it reflected Mr. Carpenter's knowledge of water and his own particular feelings about how floodwaters should be handled. So in the summer of '80, Lake Carolyn, which is our largest lake, 125 acres, evaporated 2.5 feet. Now that's like that, just in 30 days. And we became concerned about what would happen to the golf courses, what would happen to the street medians where we had some very expensive trees and landscaping, and some of our open space areas. What would happen to them if we had a repetition of the 49 to 57 drought? And so Mr. Carpenter then asked me to find a way to get a long-range water supply for irrigation for Las Colinas that would be not subject to curtailment. So at that point, then I began re-emerging myself into water resource development. And we did find a way to do it, and it's a very legally sophisticated project that involves buying the effluent from the Trinity River Authority, part of the effluent from the Trinity River Authority, and piping it up to Las Colinas. Now there's an interesting footnote to that project. When I was with the Trinity River Authority and we were expanding the central sewage treatment plant, my negotiations were with then Mayor Dan Matkin. And Mayor Matkin said that there were two reasons why he wouldn't let Irving sign the contract with TRA to expand the system. One was Irving had no representation, and two, he felt the Trinity River Authority should have an obligation to sell that effluent and use the proceeds back as a credit against the operations and maintenance costs of the system. So we solved both of Mayor Matkin's problems back in '73, but the utility district in Las Colinas was the first major purchaser of the effluent from the Trinity River Authority, which was an idea that started with Mayor Matkin in '73.
That's a wonderful story.
And so we were able to do that, and that project today in Las Colinas is the largest water reuse project in the state of Texas. Water that would otherwise go downriver is coming to Irving, is used to irrigate the 4 golf courses, several of the major corporate campuses, GTE, Exxon, the Associates, Southwestern Bell Operations Center, and so on. And it's a great water-saving device, and it has helped the city of Irving because it avoids Irving having to peak on its water purchase from Dallas.
That makes the watering in Las Colinas eminently clearer to me now as I'm driving down the street,
Right.
because it's actually reused water.
That's right.
That's an excellent reuse of it then. Absolutely.
Yes.
Now, during that period of time, there were several things going on in the development of Las Colinas that you
Right.
also had your hands in. One story that I'd love for you to share with our viewers is the story of the time, for whatever reason, the cattle that were still there on the ranch got loose and got into the lake.
Well, that's just sort of an interesting thing about, but we have, the reason you have livestock in these major real estate developments, there was a public policy reason why the legislature and the voters of Texas amended the Constitution to allow that. When our major metropolitan areas started growing after World War II, they grew into agricultural land, and those lands then started becoming valued at very high prices, forcing the owners to sell them to pay the taxes. And as a result, in the first wave of development outward from the cities, you got some terrible land use planning, and what you got on the agricultural land was fourth-rate development that in time became lowered values and was very detrimental to the urban image. So in order to keep that kind of land from having to be fire sold to pay taxes, the legislature authorized the continued use of agriculture and the valuation of that land at agriculture. But in any event, we've had cattle on the undeveloped parts of Las Colinas since the very beginning. And it enables us to hold that land back to the highest, so it can be developed for the highest and best use. So instead of having, if you didn't have that vehicle, what you might have instead of a Williams Square, which is a world-class office building, you might have a Burger King or something like that. And so it's a good public policy situation. But in any event, one Saturday morning, the cattle got loose in the lake, and Mr. Carpenter called me and said, we got to get those out. And And he and I and some of his range hands literally got him out of the lake. And that's just one of the interesting side stories of Las Colinas. But again, it points out that Mr. Carpenter didn't ask you to do something that he wouldn't do himself. And he was down in the lake with chains, getting those bulls chained so we could haul them back up over the lake wall.
Well, and not even a bull was going to stand in the way of you guys getting done what needed to be done.
That is correct.
That is wonderful. It truly is. Las Colinas, as you mentioned before, faced both good times and some very difficult times, and now again is facing wonderful times. But there was a period of time when the economy turned.
Well, we had, you know, that all goes back again to congressional policy. But first of all, you have to understand the basic premise that this area, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, is a prime corporate location area. And it's so because of DFW Airport. Whether you like DFW Airport or not, it is the economic engine of the Metroplex. And it has attracted corporations here by the thousands. And so Las Colinas is strategically located as the largest area nearest to DFW Airport. So this area is destined to continue to attract people. And so when Congress passed a bill in 1981 that really made it very easy for real estate development to occur, there was a significant building. But in 1986, Congress totally reversed course and passed the Tax Reform Act that literally jerked the rug out from under real estate development in the United States. And what was so severe about Texas was, and it was different than in other states, at that same time we had a failure of the banks in Texas, a failure of the savings and loans in Texas, and a failure of the oil and gas business. And when you had all of that happen at one time, then there was a severe setback for real estate. So the building boom ended in '86. And the buildings in Las Colinas through the next decade were able to fairly well hold their own, but there was no new building, with the exception of major corporate relocations, as GTE in 1989 and Exxon in 1990, 1991. Now you're going to, even in bad times, you're going to continue to have major companies relocate here because they're not worried about the real estate economy. They're only worried about getting their employees in a situation where their employee costs will be advantageous. And that's why people move here. Employees don't have 2-hour commute times or 4-hour commute times. When TIG moved here in I think it was 1994 from California, the employees in California had an average commute time of 2.5 hours to 4 hours a day total. They didn't have that here. And they were very surprised that more employees moved from California to Irving and Las Colinas than they had expected. And they were able to cut their operating costs by $100 million. That's why people come here.
Well, that's a very advantageous thing then for the corporate community. Obviously, it makes Las Colinas attractive.
That's right.
And it's also then by extension attractive as a place to live.
Well, and the important thing about Las Colinas is that because of the deed restriction process and the architectural control process that was devised by Mr. Carpenter, the properties in Las Colinas have maintained their values. And there have been some decreases in value, but they've gone back up right through the roof. But while other areas of the Metroplex were seeing severe drops in value, the drops in value in Las Colinas were not that significant. And it's because of the deed restriction and the architectural control process. And a company moving here can believe and know that what's going to be built next to it is going to be of a high quality nature. And so therefore they don't mind putting a lot of money into their corporate campus or their office buildings. So because the value is going to be there and the quality is going to be there. And that's what Las Colinas is all about. long-term value and quality.
When you take a look back at the course that your life has taken, it sort of followed a river, hasn't it? It sort of
Well,
followed one river to the next, and
That's
then
right.
finally ended up here at Lake Carolyn.
That's right.
When you take a look back at all of the ways that your life has come along to this point and the accomplishments that you've been able to achieve over the years with Las Colinas and the ways that you've sort of laid a foundation for the future of the state, what do you consider the most important factor that just gave you the impetus to continue through good times and bad?
Well, I think the thing is that I've always been very comfortable with my work. My work has always been something in which I could believe, in which I could put my whole heart and soul. I felt that way with the San Antonio River Authority. I felt what we were doing was for the good of the city of San Antonio. My only disappointment there was that Mr. Brune, who was my mentor in San Antonio, that he and I could not see our long-range water supply plan implemented. And I could talk for 3 days about why that didn't happen. The San Antonio situation is very complex, goes back into the 1930s and the hassle over electricity, really. And the animosities that started in 1930 are still there in San Antonio today.
My goodness.
And then the Trinity River Authority, the Trinity Master Plan, there's nothing like the Trinity River Master Plan anywhere in the world. It was so well thought out, and it was good. And when you can go down and go to the West Fork of the Trinity River and canoe in it today, when you couldn't canoe in it in 1955, before TRA was created by the legislature and Mr. Carpenter, that's an accomplishment, and those are good things. And of course, there's always been opposition. There was opposition to the Trinity Master Plan. Parts of it did not succeed because of that opposition. There was opposition to Las Colinas in 1973 by some of the environmental groups. But it's a good cause, and it has done good things. And so therefore, I've always been very committed to my work because I was comfortable with my work.